My son looked at me across the folding table at his engagement dinner and said, loud enough for his fiancée's entire family to hear, "Dad, please. Just sit quietly and let the adults talk tonight." I was 68 years old. I had raised that boy alone since he was 11. And in front of 20 strangers, he had just told me to be quiet like I was a child who didn't know how to behave in public. Nobody laughed, but nobody defended me either. His fiancée's father, a man named Gregory Ashford who owned 3 car dealerships in Charlotte, just smiled the polite smile people give when they don't want to get involved in someone else's family embarrassment. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one that matters most. My name is Walter Hayes. For 31 years, most people who crossed paths with me at the grocery store, at church, at the hardware store on Elm Street, knew me only as a quiet widower who used to work in logistics for the Army. That's what I told people when they asked. Logistics. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. My son Daniel was 36 that year. He sold commercial real estate and was good at it. Good enough that he'd started running in circles where people wore watches that cost more than my truck. He grew up watching me leave before sunrise and come home after dark, working what he believed was an ordinary government job that paid an ordinary government salary. He grew up resenting the modest house we lived in, the hand-me-down furniture, the fact that I never took him on vacations the way his friends' fathers did. What Daniel didn't know, what almost no one still living knew, was that from 1998 to 2006, I commanded the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, and later served as a brigadier general overseeing logistics and personnel for an entire division during 2 deployments. I had over 300 men and women under my direct command at different points in my career. Some of them I sent home in caskets. Some of them I sat with in field hospitals holding their hands because there was no one else there to do it. I did not talk about that time in my life, not because I was ashamed of it, but because after I retired, I made a choice. I didn't want my rank to define how people treated me. I wanted to know if people would respect me as just a man. Daniel never gave me the chance to find out because he never asked. His mother, Linda, died when he was 11, complications from a surgery that should have been routine. I was overseas when it happened. I got emergency leave, buried my wife, and made a decision that reshaped the rest of my life. I requested a transfer to a stateside logistics post so I could be home every night for my son. I turned down a promotion that would have made me a 2-star general because it would have meant more deployments, more absences, more nights where an 11-year-old boy sat alone with his grief. I never told Daniel that. I never told anyone that except my closest friend, a man named Frank Sullivan, who had served under me for 6 years and who was, at that point, the last living person who still called me Colonel out of habit before catching himself. Daniel remembered a father who missed his baseball games because of work. He remembered a father who came home exhausted and quiet. He built a version of me in his head, a tired, unremarkable man who had never accomplished much of anything, and he carried that version into adulthood. That evening at the engagement dinner wasn't the first time he embarrassed me. It was simply the clearest. 3 weeks later, Daniel called and asked if I could come to his office to sign some things. When I got there, I understood what he really wanted. He and his fiancée, Ashley, were buying a house in a gated community, and they were $40,000 short on the down payment. Daniel didn't ask for a loan the way a son asks a father. He explained it to me the way a man explains a business proposition to someone he doesn't respect. "Dad, I know you don't have much saved," he said, not unkindly, but with a certainty that stung more than cruelty would have. "But if you could talk to your bank, maybe take something out against the house, it would really help us. Ashley's parents already put in $80,000. I don't want to be the only one who shows up empty-handed." I sat there for a moment. I thought about telling him the truth right then. I thought about telling him that I could write a check for the full amount without blinking, that the modest house he grew up embarrassed by sat on land, now worth 4 times what I paid for it. That my pension, my investments, and the consulting work I still quietly did for a defense contractor added up to more than he assumed I'd ever seen in my life. I thought about all of it. And then I looked at his face, so certain of who I was, so comfortable in his own assumption, and I said, "Let me see what I can do." I gave him the $40,000 2 days later. He thanked me the way you thank someone for doing you a small favor, not the way you thank your father. Frank Sullivan called me that weekend. He always called around the same time, every other Sunday, a habit neither of us had ever bothered to break in 15 years of retirement. "You sound tired, Walt," he said. "I'm fine. You've said I'm fine to me exactly the way you used to say it before a briefing you didn't want to give. Something's wrong." I told him about the dinner. I told him about the loan. Frank was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I've thought about every day since. "You spent your whole career making sure 300 people never had to wonder if you had their back. And your own son doesn't know your name means something to more people than he'll ever meet." "He doesn't need to know," I said. "I didn't retire so people would salute me at Thanksgiving dinner." "No," Frank said, "but there's a difference between not needing respect and being treated like you don't deserve it." "Those aren't the same thing, Walt." I didn't have an answer for that. A few months later, Frank called with news. The 3rd Battalion Association, the organization of veterans who had served under my command across those years, was holding its reunion in October at Fort Bragg, to mark 25 years since our first deployment together. Frank was on the planning committee. He told me they wanted to do something they'd never done before. They wanted to formally recognize me publicly for the first time since I'd retired. "I don't need a ceremony, Frank. It's not for you," he said. "It's for them. A lot of these men and women haven't had the chance to say thank you. Some of them are gone now. The ones who are left want to do this while they still can. Let them, Walt. This one isn't about your pride, it's about theirs." I thought about that phrase for a long time. It's about theirs. I said yes. I told Daniel about the reunion almost as an afterthought, the way I might mention a dentist appointment. I asked if he wanted to come, mostly out of habit, expecting the answer I always got. To my surprise, he said yes. Ashley's father, Gregory, had been talking about veteran affairs lately, some charity work through the dealerships, and Daniel thought it might be useful, his word. Useful to bring his father-in-law along to something patriotic. He wasn't coming to honor me. He was coming because it fit a narrative he was building for himself. I let it go. I had stopped expecting Daniel to see me clearly a long time ago. The reunion was held in a large event hall on base, the kind with high ceilings and rows of folding chairs that always smell faintly of coffee and floor polish. Frank had warned me there would be a good turnout, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw when Daniel, Ashley, Gregory, and I walked through the doors that Saturday afternoon. There were nearly 300 people in that room. Men and women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, some in dress uniforms, some in slacks and blazers with small unit pins on their lapels, some in wheelchairs. One man missing his left leg below the knee, standing anyway on a prosthetic, refusing to sit for what was coming. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in 20 years. I recognized names before I recognized faces. Sergeant Delacroix, who I'd pulled out of a burning vehicle myself. Corporal Nguyen, who'd named her first daughter after my wife, Linda, because I'd sat with her the night she got the news her husband wasn't coming home. And she said no one had ever made her feel less alone in her life. Captain Reyes, who I'd personally recommended for a battlefield commission, because I'd watched him keep 11 men alive during an ambush with nothing but a radio and refusal to panic. Daniel walked beside me, checking his phone, half listening as Frank came over to shake my hand and call me Colonel out of that old habit. I watched Daniel's head tilt slightly at that. Colonel. I don't think he even registered it as strange. He assumed it was some nickname from my old desk job. We took our seats near the front. A woman I didn't recognize stepped up to the podium, introduced herself as the association's current chair, and began speaking about the anniversary, about the battalion's history, about what the day meant to everyone in that room. And then she said my name. "We are honored today to have with us the man who led many of us through the hardest years of our service. A man who, by every account we have gathered, never lost a single soldier under his direct command to friendly fire, negligence, or preventable circumstance in 8 years of leadership, because he refused to let it happen. A man who turned down his second star so he could come home to his son. A man who, 25 years later, still gets a letter or a phone call from someone in this room roughly once a month, checking on them, remembering their birthdays, remembering the names of their children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brigadier General Walter Hayes. I heard Daniel's phone slide out of his hand and hit the floor. I stood up because Frank was gently pulling on my sleeve, and because 300 people were rising to their feet at once, the sound of it like a wave breaking, chairs scraping back in unison. And then, in a single motion that had clearly been rehearsed, drilled into muscle memory decades ago and never forgotten, every single person in that room raised their right hand to their brow in salute. I have commanded men through gunfire. I have stood in field hospitals and told mothers their sons weren't coming home. I have signed papers that ended careers and papers that saved lives. I did not cry during any of it. I cried then, standing in that hall, looking at 300 faces holding a salute for a man who had only ever tried to bring them home alive. I looked over at my son. Daniel was standing too, because everyone was standing, but he wasn't looking at me the way a man looks at a stranger. He was looking at me the way you look at someone you suddenly realize you have never actually seen. His mouth was slightly open. Ashley had a hand pressed to her chest. Gregory Ashford, the car dealership owner who had smiled politely through my humiliation months earlier, was staring at me like the ground had shifted under his feet. After the applause faded and the room settled back into conversation, Daniel found me near the coffee table, standing alone for a moment while Frank went to greet an old friend. "General," he said quietly, testing the word. "Dad, why didn't you ever?" He stopped, started again. "I asked you for $40,000. You did. You could have," he rubbed his hand over his face. "I told you to sit quietly at my own engagement dinner. I told my father, a brigadier general, to sit quietly." "You told your father to sit quietly," I said. "Not a rank, me. That's what hurt, Daniel, not the words. The fact that you thought so little of the man standing in front of you that you didn't consider I might have feelings worth protecting." He didn't have an answer. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my son had nothing to say. "I never told you," I said, "because I didn't want you to respect me for what I did overseas. I wanted you to respect me because I was your father, because I stayed up with you when you had the flu, because I taught you to drive, because I never missed a single phone call in your life, even when I was 12 time zones away. That respect should never have needed a uniform behind it. The fact that it did, that's on both of us, maybe. I let you build a version of me that was smaller than the truth because it was easier than making you see me." Daniel's eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't even know what I'm apologizing for first." "Start with the dinner," I said, and for the first time in months I almost smiled. "Work your way backward from there." We stayed at the reunion until the hall emptied out. Daniel spent most of the afternoon quiet, shaking hands with men and women who told him stories about me he had never heard. The general who remembered every soldier's birthday, who drove 4 hours once to sit with a young corporal's family after a training accident, who paid for a funeral out of his own pocket when a soldier's family couldn't afford one, and never told a soul about it until Frank let it slip that day. Every story chipped away at the smaller man Daniel had carried in his head for 25 years. Things did not become perfect overnight. Old habits and old resentments don't dissolve in a single afternoon. But something shifted in my son that day, something that showed itself in small ways over the following months. He started calling just to talk, not just when he needed something. He returned the $40,000 without me asking, said it didn't feel right anymore, though I told him he never needed to. He started introducing me differently at family gatherings, not as my dad, said with a shrug, but as my father, said with something closer to weight. 6 months later, at his wedding, Daniel stood up during the reception, took the microphone from the best man before the scheduled toasts, and said something I still carry with me. "Most of you know my father as a quiet man who doesn't say much. I spent 36 years thinking that meant there wasn't much to say. I was wrong. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who never once tell you why you should respect them. They just wait to see if you're paying enough attention to find out on your own. I wasn't for a long time. I am now." He raised his glass to me across the room. "And 300 veterans weren't there to salute this time. just family and friends. But I felt the same wave of recognition wash over me anyway, quieter, smaller, but somehow just as complete. Respect should never depend on a person's title. Sometimes the people who know your name know the least about your story. Blood makes you family. How you treat each other decides whether you stay one.